Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and get the technology rolling and make sure that we are good to go. Thank you for joining me. My name is Natalie, and I am a tarot reader and astrologer here on YouTube. Thank you very much. And I do see that I am up and running. Let me just check it out here. Hey, everybody. Oh, good. Sound is working. Garnet Goddess. Hey. Hey, thank you for being here. Hi, everybody. And for those of you watching the video later, hi later. And let's go ahead. Thank you. Thank you, Garda Goddess. I appreciate that. These are just like the blue light blocking glasses, and I've been doing a lot of computer work, but thank you, everybody. And today I've got an interesting reading for you. So for those of you who know what's been going on with Danny Masterson. So Danny Masterson played Hyde in that 70s show. And recently he was found, he was sentenced actually to the assault of two women that happened in the earlier 2000s. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. And anyway, Danny Masterson doesn't have a birth time. Now, the reason why I called it Danny Masterson's wife, and I didn't just put her name, is because a lot of people may not know her name. But Danny Masterson doesn't, like I said, he doesn't have a birth time, but his wife does have a reliable birth time with a rodent rating of A. So I can find a birth time for her. So I'm going to do her chart. And anyway, through the partner's chart, we can see a lot about that partner that they're choosing. And actually, when I started looking at her chart, I was like, oh, wow, of course she's married to a convicted, person who assaulted two women, like, of course she's married to him. And her family history is very interesting on top of that. And we're going to take a look at what is going on in her chart and what her chart says about her relationships. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to share, for those of you who know Bijou Phillips, she is the daughter of John Phillips and Guinevere Waite. And John Phillips was in the Mamas and the Papas, which is a really famous band from like the 1970s, 1980s, 1960s. And they did that song, California Dreaming on Such a Winter's Day. You guys remember that song, California Dreaming? That is her father that did that song. So that is Bijou Phillips' father. She comes from a very famous family. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's go ahead and take a look. So before I show her chart, I'm just going to show a little bit about her. Here she is right here. Now, she came up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and she was kind of like a party girl with Paris Hilton and Nikki Hilton and, the whole crew back in the day. And she does come from a very famous family. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from her Wikipedia before we get into her chart. So Bijou Phillips Masterson, obviously she's married to Danny Masterson. We'll talk a little bit more about him, is an American actress, model, and singer. She is the daughter of musician John Phillips and Guinevere Waite. She began her career as a model when she was 14 years old. Phillips made her singing debut with I'd Rather Eat Glass, her album, in 1999. And she was in films like Almost Famous in early 2000, Door in the Floor, Hostel Part 2, for those of you who are like horror buffs who like the Hostel movies. She played in Hostel Part 2. She was in the movie Choke, and she was also playing Lucy Carlisle on the television series Raising Hope. Okay. And she was born on April 1st, 1980 in Greenwich, Connecticut. And she is the daughter of John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. And So there's some controversies surrounding her father. So let me just go ahead and show, before I show her and Danny. So this is Bijou Phillips' father right there, part of the Mamas and the Papas. There's Mama Cass, Michelle Phillips, and I think he was Denny somebody. But they had a very famous band in the 1960s, tons of music, wrote California Dreamin'. And anyway, this is Bijou Phillips' father right here. Now, the interesting thing about him and their family is that Bijou Phillips, her sister came out and said that she had had a 10-year incestuous relationship with her father starting when she was 19 years old, and that her father had taken advantage of her while she was blacked out and passed out. Now, here is, I will show you guys. So this is Bijou Phillips' father, and that is Bijou Phillips' sister, Mackenzie. And allegedly, she had a 10-year incestuous relationship with her father. Her father was, like I said, John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. He was a heavy, heavy drug user. So was Mackenzie. But he did take advantage of her. She was only 19 years old, and he started that very inappropriate relationship with his daughter in a way that a relationship should never be started. And so, keep in mind, Bijou Phillips comes from a family where, assault and inappropriate relationships, men having inappropriate relationships with their daughters. She is from a family that is already having this history. Now, so keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about Bijou Phillips' husband, Danny Masterson, who was convicted of SA. I'm going to call it SA, but convicted of assaulting two women in a sexual manner. So, she's had this history of her father doing that to her sister, and then her husband doing that to other women. Now, what's interesting about Bijou Phillips is she has two siblings. This is Mackenzie, the one who was assaulted by her father, the one that took the brunt of that abuse. And then her other sister, China Phillips, who's married to Billy Baldwin. And China Phillips used to sing in that band, Wilson Phillips, from back in the day. They had that song, Hold On, if some of you remember that. But anyway, these three are sisters and are the daughter of John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. So kind of keeping in mind, there's a lot of players in this story, and we're going to talk more about it as we go. But I just wanted to point out to you guys, hi, Tovar. Hi there. Hi, everybody. Yay. I love the comments. And anyway, so, already she is coming from a family with a lot of incest and secrets and fueled with drug use and abuse. And, already she's coming from a family like this. Now, Bijou Phillips met Danny Masterson from that 70s show, and I'll show you him here in a second. Do you guys remember that 70s show from back in the day with Ashton, whatever the hell his name is? I can't stand the guy, Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis. They were starring in that show with Laura Prepon, and there's Wilmer Valdemir, and right there is Danny Masterson, and he played Hyde in that 70s show from back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So he's a famous actor, but a lot of people don't know about Danny Masterson is that he's a Scientologist, and he assaulted many women, and he had a reputation for assaulting women back in the day. Now, this is Bijou Phillips' husband. And it's interesting because Danny Masterson had an interview with Conan O'Brien where Conan O'Brien back in the early 2000s was like, oh, we know about you and you're going to get caught. So he was already having a reputation of being sexually violent, of being a predator. He already had that reputation in the early 2000s. And here he is right here looking like Hyde from that 70s show. There's Bijou Phillips with him, and these two are married. So we've got that going on. Now, here's a picture of Danny Masterson leaving court in Los Angeles with Bijou, with his wife. They now have a daughter together. I think she's 8 or 9, but this is, I believe this was after he got convicted, I believe, of SAing 2 women. I believe this picture is from after his conviction. He was recently sentenced on September 7th to 30 years in prison to life for the for the conviction of 2 assaults of 2 women. Now, 2 women weren't the only ones that he assaulted. There were many other people, but they got conviction for 2. And he had it, and other people who didn't. There was actually 3, I think, who came forward, but there are other ones, if you go back far enough, who mentioned what a creep he was, what a rapist he was, what a horrible, person he was, and how violent he actually is with women, and abusive and controlling, violent, all of that. And sexual predator, actually. So Danny Masterson from that 70s show really coming out and seeing who he really is as a predator. And like I said, people in Hollywood knew about him for the last 20 years, but Scientology was keeping those women from coming forward and actually sharing their story, and was threatening them and all of this. So now Scientology is all wrapped up in this. So now here's Bijou Phillips. And like I said, I don't have a birth time for Danny Masterson, so I can't do his chart, but I can do his wife's chart because I do have a birth time for her. And her chart is definitely very interesting. Like I mentioned, she has a father who is a sexual assault person, and now she has a husband who also is, and is going to prison for it. So let's go ahead and take a look. Let's see if I have any other pictures. That was her father and her sister, the one that he abused, the 3 siblings. Oh, and I'm going to talk to you guys about this later. This is something else. But anyway, so that's Bijou Phillips. And it says at 14 years old, Bijou left school and moved into her own apartment with a housekeeper on Fifth Avenue. She was once described as a wild child. She experienced a rebellious childhood in New York City where she used to party, drink, and take drugs, and, she hung out with Paris and Nikki Hilton. Now you're saying, what is a 14-year-old doing with their own apartment? And what is a 14-year-old, like, why is that happening? Why is she like totally on her own? And she has these like famous parents. Her parents were heavy, heavy drug users. And when she was 3 years old, she got taken away from her parents and put into foster care. So she's had a very challenging life. But a lot of people, here's her chart. A lot of people don't really feel sorry for her because she has defended her father. Now her father's passed, but she has told her sister, I don't believe you. I don't believe what our father did to you. I think you're lying. I don't think you have a good memory. I don't believe you. So she's not believed survivors. She's also talked really badly about those who've accused her husband of assault and bullied and said bad things. Also, co-stars that have worked with her came out and said that she was bullying people back in the day on shows, making fun of people. People, it's interesting with her because you get the feeling that she's not the greatest person either. And before I start reading her chart, I just want to point out something too, because she has a lot of childhood trauma and she is the victim of abuse, but also from what I've read about her, she is also an abuser. And I think we need to kind of understand that because she's 40 years old at this point, and you can be both like an abused child and you can also be an abuser, so we have to be able to hold space for both things to exist, right? And so that's something I want us to keep in mind as we're looking at her chart here. And I'm going to read you a couple quotes by her just to kind of kick things off before we get into her chart. And I just want to make sure. Okay. Yes. Okay. We are all good. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, first things first, let's point out what is just the basics of her chart. So she is an Aquarius rising. We can see here. Oh, that's way too big of a line. Ooh, me goodness. Oh, okay. Smaller line, please. So we can see here, she's an Aquarius rising. She has the South Node on her ascendant right there. Okay. She also is a Sun in Aries. Okay. And she has Moon in Libra. Now, right away, you guys are going, oh my gosh, look at that Moon Pluto conjunction in the 8th house in her horrible family history, in the history of women in her family being abused. And you're probably already taking note of that. And as I mentioned, she also went into foster care when she was 3 years old because her parents were too strung out and couldn't take care of her. And so, you know, this whole thing of losing the family and being given up to foster care and the very, very, very painful, abusive family history that she comes from, we can already see it right away with the Moon Pluto conjunction. Another thing about her, you know, she is an Aquarius rising with this South Node in her ascendant. Okay. And we're going to talk about like South Node rising and what that all means too. So let's go ahead and pause there for just a second. Also taking note of she has Mercury in Pisces in the 1st house here, square Neptune. It's a wider square, but it's there. And because she's an Aquarius rising, Saturn is the ruler of her ascendant. So we can see that Saturn at 22 degrees retrograde in the 7th house of partnerships and also in a square to Neptune. Okay. So we're already seeing kind of like a Pisces Neptune kind of flavor happening here, although she's an Aquarius rising. And you may have also noticed right away too, that her North and South Node are in the 1st house and in the 7th house by the 5-degree rule. This South Node and North Node would be in the 1st and 7th house. And those nodes are both squaring that Venus-Uranus opposition. So already just looking at her chart, we can see what an impact her romantic relationships are going to have on her fate and her life and change her life in a very, very significant way. So she has this Venus in domicile and Taurus opposite Uranus, both squaring the nodes, which is squaring the North Node and the South Node. So huge emphasis on relationships, huge emphasis around fate and karma in relationships as well. And as we said, her husband was just convicted 30 years to life of assaulting 2 women. So let's go ahead and I will read you guys a couple of things here. So we're going to talk about a quote that she said, where she said, "I've always been treated as an object, not as a human being." So she said this about herself. And when we talk about and when she says, "I've always been treated as an object and not as a human being," my feeling about that is she feels she's been treated as a sexual object and not as a human being. And Bijou Phillips, the interesting thing about the fact how she doesn't support her sister as far as being a survivor of their father, and she doesn't support the women who her husband assaulted. She doesn't support those women, but at the same time, she's been a victim of that as well. She was modeling when she was like 14 years old in those very revealing Calvin Klein ads. And she was in clubs in New York City when she was like 14 years old. Men were constantly hitting on her, constantly grabbing her, this whole type of thing. So she has, and I believe she lost her virginity to like a 25-year-old when she was like 16, and then he left her like 4 days later. So she hasn't, had the greatest experience with her own experience with men either. And the fact that she can't support her sister, or she can't support these women, or she still is standing by Danny Masterson, just also tells you kind of how out to lunch she is, or just how demented she is in her own reality. And we'll talk about a demented reality with her. Notice she's represented by Saturn and Virgo, square Neptune. Talk about a demented reality. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of her quotes, I think, just to start off, and then we'll really get into the chart. Okay. So I like to read their quotes when I'm doing celebrity charts, like things that they've said, because I feel like, well, it's really going to resonate with their chart. So one thing that she said is music is real. You can touch and feel it. Music makes your soul feel amazing. Now, keep in mind, she has Mercury in Pisces rising, square Neptune. So like she's very dreamy. She's not very focused. And when you watch some of her interviews, she kind of seems like she's a little bit like out to lunch. There's a Howard Stern interview of her on YouTube where now granted, she's younger, but she kind of has like a baby doll type of a voice, and she seems kind of ditzy and kind of like a Marilyn Monroe type of a way. But what's interesting is she does have Mercury rising, and Danny Masterson said about her that he was surprised upon getting to know her that she's actually like smart and she's read all the books that he's read. And so that to me is interesting with the Mercury rising and the Aquarius rising too, like intellectual in a way, but also kind of flaky and out there and kind of a space cadet with the Mercury in Pisces. And so I find that very interesting as well. She also said, you never really want something you can easily have. And to me, that represents her sun in Aries. Like, that's a real Aries type of thing to say. Like, I want a challenge. I don't just want something that's easy to have. Okay. That's also very much like a Mars Rahu, Mars in the North Node and Leo type of statement as well. And that Mars is squaring Venus right there too. So I don't want I have men throwing themselves at me all the time and flirting with me all the time. I want somebody that's not easy to get. She said the first time she met Danny Masterson at a poker tournament in 2004, that he wasn't like paying attention to her and he wasn't like flirting with her right away. And he was just kind of treating her like whatever. And that got her intrigued with him. Like, who is he and why can't I get his attention? And we see that Venus square Mars there as well too, like needing sexual attention or needing male attention or using her sexuality to kind of get things. But then he's not really paying attention to her. So then he's a challenge, right? Sun in Aries. Then she wants him more. So there's this kind of energy going on with her too. And, when you see her like talking and doing interviews, she doesn't come off as a Sun in Aries. She comes off as kind of like, she almost comes off like a Pisces in a way, or she comes off kind of like quirky, ditzy, kind of out there, kind of hippie, space cadet kind of energy, weirdo type of a thing. And the weirdo energy that she kind of puts out there, the quirky, like weirdo energy, is definitely the Aquarius rising, but it's also the South Node rising on her ascendant. It's also K2 rising, because K2 is a misfit, and K2 is like not normal, and K2 is kind of like out there. And keep in mind that K2 or the South Node is headless. And so K2 is just kind of a wanderer going around with no purpose. And you kind of get that from her a little bit, that she's a little bit like of a wanderer soul. Her father was, like I said, John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, like a real hippie band that like took drugs all the time. So you get this kind of K2 energy with her where she seems kind of out to lunch and kind of just talking. She has like kind of a soft, like baby doll voice in a way, which is very Mercury and Pisces. And all of that, she kind of comes off as being like this very vulnerable little girl, but also yet tough. And you do get that with the Sun in Aries in the first house, but also, Mercury in Pisces, K2 on the ascendant. You get that kind of dual action going on there. And kind of like the baby doll, kind of like a Marilyn Monroe type of an energy. And so anyway, she's also said, the fact of the matter is I'm 21 years old now. I stay home. I feed my dogs. I don't really go out. I work. Now that's interesting because most 21-year-olds are like, I go out, I party, I do what I want, right? But she already started partying when she was 14 years old, like living on her own. And so her whole thing when she was 21 was like, I'm just at home with my dogs. That's a very K2 type of a thing as well, to be kind of like retiring and to not really doing stuff out there in the world and wanting to be more like at home and not really like wanting kind of the whole like social aspect of everything kind of like exhausting her. She's like, now I just stay home with my dogs at 21, so she already got all the partying kind of out of her system when she was younger. She also has been quoted as saying, my dad was a great dad. Okay. And my dad was a great dad. Even though he, assaulted my sister for 10 years and drugged her up and did all these horrible things and was, a very talented musician, but also at the same time, a horrible human being, she's quoted as saying, my dad is a great person. And, her mom and dad were so messed up back in the day, they couldn't even take care of her. So that's that very idealistic viewpoint of things. And in her chart, the ruler of the fourth house, which represents the father, is this Mercury. So her father is in her first house, Mercury in Pisces, and her dad is square Neptune. So it's like, I don't really have a good vision of like who my father is. And I don't really like, I'm delusional about my father, or I'm living in a make-believe world about my father, or I think he's this great man, but actually he's a predator. Like there's this whole denial thing going on with her chart and on a pretty deep level that I see going on. And my dad was the best person in the world. Moon, Pluto in the 8th house. Yeah, my family's great. They're amazing. They're wonderful. I don't think so. But then next I have here too, she says, I depend on Danny. Okay, this is her husband, the one who was just charged. I depend on Danny to take care of me and our daughter. And he reads her books, takes her on walks, take her to ballet lessons. So she's saying she depends on him. Now, here's the thing I find interesting, because in her chart, the partner is represented by this sun, Leo. Okay, so Leo is the ruler of her 7th house. So we go find that sun in Aries. So, and he's in her first house and she's in his 7th house. Okay, she's represented by Aquarius or Saturn. She's in his house and he's in her house. So here's this kind of dependency thing. But I wonder if, because she is kind of quirky, weird, out to lunch, not really like planning things, not really keeping track of schedules, Mercury in Pisces, a little like can't focus on things, not really remembering the details, more of a creative mind, less of a mind of I'm picking my daughter up at this time and this time and this time, right? And so it makes me think that possibly Danny is the one who's more like practical or grounded or sort of like taking care of things. But now he's, going to be in prison. So very interesting looking at her quotes. She's also quoted as saying, like that she never had her innocence and that she lost her innocence from the very beginning. And to me, that's a very world weary type of a quote. And like, I'm very world weary and I don't trust the world. And to me, that's very Saturnian as this Aquarius rising, but it's also very K2. It's very South Node to be like, I'm tired, I'm exhausted. Like the South Node is a weak point for health, and it does represent a weakness health-wise. And, Bijou Phillips has had some really awful health problems, which we'll talk about in a little bit too. But that whole Saturnian aspect of being tired of the world or being world weary or being exhausted by the world, like being sick of it, being tired of it. On her album that she put out, there was a song on it called So Tired, which to me is very K2. It's like, I was born into this world tired. I was born into this world exhausted. I was born into this world like very world weary. And we can see, like I told you guys, that Saturn at 22 Virgo retrograde represents her and her health as well. And that Saturn is in a square to Neptune, Neptune being very draining, very tiring. And what I also think is very interesting is that there's some articles that have come out about how she's doing after her husband has been convicted of assault. And the news is saying that she's, quote unquote, circling the drain. And I find that very interesting, that language, circling the drain, because, my original astrology teacher taught me about a couple points in the chart that kind of represent the toilet bowl, is what he used to call them, and circling the drain in the toilet bowl, which just means areas where we're losing energy, leaking energy, areas that are a bummer, that are like, crappy, pretty much crappy health, crappy attitude, crappy mind, and Neptune can definitely, depending on what Neptune is doing in your chart, Neptune can be a huge toilet bowl. And so is the South Node. Now, the South Node is also really amazing for like wisdom and learning and spiritual growth, but it is a weak point when it comes to health. And also when it comes to mental health, the South Node can be very weakening. And, that whole idea of she's been like circling the drain ever since this happened was very interesting to me, because I'm like, of course she's circling the drain. She's got K2 rising. I feel like she's been circling the drain her whole life, pretty much. And, the ruler of her ascendant being squared to Neptune. Of course, she's tired, she's exhausted, she's weak, and her chart really shows like her kind of giving her power and strength over to her partner while she's very debilitated and weak. And, also I think because she's not able to support these survivors and stand up for her husband, and she's not able to support her sister in her abuse allegations towards her father, like she is a very weak person. And we can see, not everybody that has K2 rising or the South Node rising is, incredibly spiritual and incredibly like wise. Like some people are just weak, and the past has them in the grip of a claw that will not let go. And you can see that claw coming out with the Moon Pluto conjunction in the 8th house too. Like, her past and her family and where she comes from and her past lives, all kind of accumulating in her first house of self. And, as much as she would like to avoid like the truth, or as much as she would like to not have to deal with things, she's gonna have to deal with things, And because her husband has been convicted to 30 years in prison and she has a daughter, and, she's going to have to deal, quote unquote, deal with life. But I also think like she is exhausted from her childhood. And I do think she's not probably the most organized person. And I don't know, as horrible of a person as he is, and as big as a, predator as he is she going to be able to kind of care for her own daughter on a day-to-day basis without him around? And the thing that is very sad about this chart too is, we have her father being an abuser, then her husband's an abuser, and now her own child has a similar fate that she had, and if you look at the ruler of the 5th house, which is, there's no planets in the 5th house, but the ruler of the 5th house is Cancer, or the moon. So her children are represented by that moon in Libra in the 8th house in a conjunction with Pluto. So this also tells me like her children are not getting the childhood that, her child is not going to get the ideal childhood either. And her own child is going to continue to be plagued by these issues of having a predator father. Just like she had a predator father, her child now has a predator father. And so we see like, the absolute chokehold that the karmic forces in life can kind of have on us when we're too weak mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, like when we're too weak to kind of do anything to change our fate. And when we're too weak of a person, or we're too weak in our physical health. I mean, physical health is one thing, but I also feel with her, it's not just her physical health that's weak. She's a mentally weak person is also what I feel too. And, I'm not trying to get down on Mercury and Pisces because, as we know, Mercury is very debilitated in Pisces. And, one of my best friends has Mercury in Pisces, so I'm not trying to get down on it. She's very creative. She's very intuitive. She's an amazing opera singer. Like, she's amazing, but not everybody handles evolutionary energy the same way. Some people are just like, mentally weak-minded and, overly optimistic about people that are like sucking their life energy down the drain. You know what I mean? So I think, Mercury in Pisces is very optimistic. Oh, everything will work out. I don't know the details. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know, but everything will just work out, and it's like, no, not everything is working out here. And so it is a very sad story, and it is very sad for her children, or for her child in particular, because her child is now having the same fate. Like, I lost my father, my family's fucked up. Like, my family has a deep and very painful history. And it affects me to the point where my whole life is changed because of that. As we look at her children in her 8th house in a conjunction with Pluto, her own children suffering the same fate as her. Now, that as a parent, if you're a person who's actually like awake and living in the world, that as a parent is karmically pretty bad, that's bad, so I don't know, guys, but it doesn't look good for her. Now, let's go ahead and sorry, that's like really, you guys are like, wow, that's depressing. And I'm like, yeah, it is, So let's go ahead and do a little bit more. So I'm just going to check my notes because, as I said, as an Aquarius rising with the South Node in Aquarius rising on her ascendant, she is, like I said, kooky, otherworldly, spacey, alternative, different. K2 South Node is very spacey, is very otherworldly. K2 doesn't have the head. Rahu is the head that's consuming everything, and K2 is the body of the snake that's kind of just wandering around. And her childhood was like that too. It was like a wandering around type of a childhood. When she was 3 years old, she was forced to go live in foster care because her parents couldn't take her. So it's like, I don't know where I belong. I'm kind of like all over the place. And she's mentioned in an interview when they pulled her away from her mother, like when they physically took her and pulled her away from her mother to go put her in foster care growing up, that she screamed and she yelled, and they had to take, even though she was only like 3 years old, it took 2 people to kind of pull her away from her mother. Now, her mother was also a drug addict and not responsible, not there, not around. But when she talks about her mother, she talks about her mother as like this fairy princess who was like really smart and very Mercury in Pisces, like very idealistic, my mother was a fairy princess and she was very smart and da, da, da. And it's like, no, I mean, her mother really so she talks about in a story of being ripped out of her mother's arms, and 2 full adults having to rip her out of her mother's arms, and her like screaming and wailing. And, that's very Moon Pluto in the 8th house, isn't it? That's primal screaming and yelling and moaning. And the judge said at Danny Masterson's trial that when he was actually convicted, people said in the courtroom when he had his conviction that she just let out like a wail, like she just like wailed. And I imagine for her that felt like that abandonment wound from childhood getting re-triggered again, like, getting pulled away from her mother like that, and then them taking her away from her husband and pulling him away. And the judge actually told her, like, if you can't keep your composure, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the courtroom, because she just let out this very like wail that was like guttural wail. And that's very like Moon Pluto, that intensity of that emotion and in that moment of being ripped away, is a Moon Pluto function. And so you can see she came into a very, very, like the moment she was born, she came into a very, challenging circumstance. And you would feel very sorry for her, like if she wasn't like, here's the thing, like I said at the beginning of this reading, she is an abused person who's turned into an abuser. And a lot of people have had some things to say about her too, and the way she's treated people and how she, it's interesting. We're going to get into it. Okay. And I have a quote from a director that worked with her on a movie that said, "You never knew what Bijou was going to say or do next." Like you never knew what she was going to say or to do next. Very Mercury and Pisces in the first house, very K2 rising. You never knew what she was going to say or do next. There was no line between her unconscious and her articulation of her unconscious and her behavior. Okay, so he's saying there's no line there between her articulation and her unconsciousness, Mercury and Pisces, like blah, blah, blah. It's just all coming out of her. She is a genuine psychopath, is what he said about her. She's a genuine psychopath. She's incredibly smart, okay, Mercury rising, talented, knows how to amuse people and hold their attention. Look at that Venus in Taurus in the third house of socializing, talking to people, flirting with people. She has that Venus in Taurus, square Mars, opposite Uranus. So of course she's holding people's attention. Of course she's like bringing people in with her, like, vivacious energy. Of course she's like, being charming and glib and keeping people's attention and wanting attention. It's a very interesting energy with her, like on one hand, she didn't like that all these, older men were flirting with her. But on the other hand, you get the impression that she was kind of like, very attention seeking at the same time too, which I'm sure comes from her history of childhood abuse. But you're kind of starting to understand her psychological makeup, I feel here a little bit. Okay. So what she said about her mother. "My mother was a beautiful soul from another planet, a light and a fairy. Her mind was poetry and her sense of humor quick and dry." Doesn't that sound like Mercury and Pisces? I feel like it does. And, it's interesting the way she describes her mother, but, but at the same time, her mother had to give her up because she couldn't quit using drugs. So not a responsible person. And so we have that Moon Pluto aspect that I talked about. Also, I would like to, so there was a period of time in her childhood when her father was around, and she said her father was like Mr. Mom and he was around. And, at 13 years old, her sister came out and said, that their father was abusing her. So that really rocked her world in a lot of ways. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about her Aries sun. Okay, so Bijou Phillips was born April 1st, April Fool's Day, and she has sun in Aries. Now, I kind of talked about her being kind of a little girl and kind of girly, kind of out to lunch. It seems kind of like she doesn't know what's going on, but she actually does in a weird way. Like she is a sun in Aries, keep in mind, because she was in boarding school after she got out of foster care and went to go live with her dad for just a little bit. She went to boarding school. To get out of boarding school, she went to go model. And that's when she got her own apartment at 14 years old in New York City and was out partying with older people at different clubs in New York City at 14 years old. Now, that is very independent. That is very Sun and Aries, very independent. I want my independence. Like, you can't tell me what to do. I'll do whatever the hell I want. I am going to go. And she did emancipate herself from her parents. Which is very Aries, like, I don't need anybody. I can do this on my own. And so she does have that aspect to her. So we will look at that. And she also made a comment about her father. Like, she said, my dad was the best dad, but she also said, my father was a man without boundaries. Okay. And the ruler of the fourth house, of course, is that Mercury square Neptune, her father, you know, a man without boundaries. Her whole family not really having good boundaries from what it sounds like. And the other thing I want to talk about with her is some of the health issues that she's had as well. So Bijou Phillips was born with very small kidneys, and it was said that her mother was using heroin when she was, and look at that, right? Moon, Pluto in the eighth house, mother using heroin, very dark circumstances there. And she was born with very, very small kidneys. And we talked about those health issues and how K2 or the South Node is a weak point for health issues. Now, she was on kidney dialysis for a while because of her small kidneys. In the year 2017, she finally had a kidney transplant and has been able to do that. But that kidney issue almost killed her and was very debilitating. And when we talk about the kidneys and health issues in astrology, we're talking and the ability to like filter our blood, and the kidneys being associated, you know, the adrenals and the kidneys and filtering blood. All of that really in medical astrology has to do with the Aries Libra polarity. So obviously we know Aries and Libra are two opposite signs. And when we're talking about like the kidneys not working, first of all, Libra rules the kidneys. And second of all, Mars has to do with the blood. So, you know, when we see that kidney issue, we really are speaking about Mars Libra. Now, keep in mind, Bijou Phillips was born just after a full moon. Look at that sun opposition moon, born literally after a full moon in Libra. But we already see that health aspect showing up in her chart. When I saw that, when I heard about her kidney disease and the fact that she was born with small kidneys and she needed a transplant, I was like, well, yeah, you know, when I saw her sun moon polarity there with Aries Libra, obviously a big part of her chart. But we can also, when we're talking about medical astrology, we also can look at the houses. And you know, I'm the first one to say, like, you don't associate the first house with Aries, and the seventh house isn't associated with Libra, because the houses have their own meanings. And that's a very like modern day astrology thing to say a house is associated with a sign. It really isn't. Traditional astrology didn't treat it like that at all. But in medical astrology, the houses are associated with the sign in traditional medical astrology. And so the first house being associated with the adrenals, with the blood, that type of energy, Aries energy, and the second house having to do, or the seventh house having to do with the adrenals and the kidneys. Look at that Mars Rahu conjunction. Now that Mars Rahu conjunction would be in the seventh house by the 5-degree rule. You know, she's got Mars Rahu conjunction in the seventh house. Again, the blood, the kidneys, the issues with her South Node there on her ascendant. And so we can see already in her chart these significant health challenges that she has. The other thing that I would say that indicates just weak health in general is the ruler of her ascendant being in almost an exact square to Neptune. Like that is a partile square that is almost exact to the minute. And so, of course, Neptune creating a drain or sometimes creating a drain on our energy. So you can already tell in her chart that she does have these medical issues, and she has been dealing with health issues her whole life as it pertains to her kidneys, her adrenals, her blood, her kidneys not being able to filter her blood. This is very much a medical astrology type of an issue. Hi, Holly. Interesting that her name means jewel or trinket. Yeah, that's right, Holly. I'm so happy you're here. And yeah, Bijou means jewel or trinket. And she's a pretty tiny little thing, like if you see a picture of her, I'll show a picture of her again. Like, she is very like, here she is. And she doesn't look, but if you see her on like the Howard Stern interview, she's very tiny. I think she's like 5'7", and at the time she was like 100 and I don't know, 10 pounds or something like she's very tiny, very much like a tiny little blonde thing. And, very like kind of dressed, kind of hippie, quirky kind of energy, very definitely giving the blue eyes, blonde hair, Aquarian energy that sometimes you see those blue eyes with Aquarius. And she definitely looks like an Aquarius rising, I think. And she's definitely has very quirky mannerisms too, like an Aquarius rising. And but yeah, her name does mean jewel. So very interesting. And let's talk a little bit about, so one thing that's I want to point out about her South Node rising here on her ascendant is that Ketu is a nomad, and Ketu was associated with nomads who just went around living off the good graces of people who would help them and give them money. And I do feel that her early life was like that in foster care, just kind of being like passed around to different people, kind of like a nomad, kind of like no home, Moon Pluto, like my home and my family is destroyed. Like I came into this life without really having a home or a place to go. And then as soon as she got out of foster care, she went straight into boarding school, and then she was living on her own. So there really was no sense of that. And let's go ahead and see, with that K2 rising, South Node rising, I just feel it's very hard for her to get off the karmic wheel. And for all the reasons I already mentioned, like that karmic wheel is just going and going. And for those of you that remember, another celebrity, a chart that I did that had K2 rising was Ben Affleck. And if you recall, Ben Affleck had K2 South Node rising in the first house as well. He had this same placement. I believe his was in Leo, though. But with Ben Affleck, remember how I told you guys his father was an alcoholic, and then he became what he never wanted to be, which was an alcoholic, and that, he was embarrassed in front of his children, and that, his grandfather was an alcoholic, his father was or maybe it was his grandmother, but it goes down the family line, and there's all these alcoholics. And then Ben Affleck is, stuck dealing with the karma of all those alcoholics now, and himself being an alcoholic, and then trying to fix himself. And, when you see him, sometimes he just looks very plagued by the heaviness of K2. Now, here she is the last born child in her family. She has K2 rising, and here she is. Her father was a predator and abuser. Her husband is. Now her husband's going to prison for 30 years. Her father didn't go to prison. Her father was a famous musician who made tons of money and did whatever he wanted. But her husband doesn't get to do that. Her husband's in prison, and she's going to raise her daughter by herself. And so, this very interesting quality of K2 and her having to deal with all of that kind of family karma. And like I mentioned, we saw that in Ben Affleck's chart, and very interesting. And again, here she is now. I mean, look at it. It's like, oh my God, Like, you know, she's going to deal with that karma. She's definitely going to be dealing with that family karma. So, yeah. And the Moon Pluto person is often the person in the family that is dealing with the heavy, heavy shit and the heavy, heavy karma. Now, another thing with her Aquarius rising and South Node in Aquarius, I think Bijou Phillips got left alone a lot as a child. And I feel like she was very independent, but very odd, and that she was thought of herself as being misunderstood by a lot of people. That's very Aquarius rising, South Node rising, to feel like, you know, independent, odd, left alone a lot, misunderstood, very much in that energy. We talked about the Aries sun and how she emancipated herself at 14 years old. And let's see what else I want to talk about. And we talked about the Mercury in Pisces, dreamy, poetic, not great at analyzing things, maybe not great at sorting out the details and understanding what's what, you know. And I mentioned how she said her parents had a beautiful, amazing, poetic relationship. It's like, I think your parents were addicts that like cheated on each other all the time. And, you know, I don't think so. But you know, we see that delusional kind of, it's almost like she also made a comment about how she grew up in a family of junkies and therefore she didn't know how to do anything herself. Like she didn't know how to like, you know, learn regular things that people learn when they're younger. So you can see that whole K2 Aquarius rising, like being left alone, misunderstood, wandering around, not really having a home, not really learning the things that she should be learning, kind of out to lunch a little bit. Okay. And next, I want to talk a little bit about, so we fully have discussed her first house and that ascendant. Now I want to talk a little bit about the ruler of her ascendant, which is this Saturn in Virgo retrograde in the 7th house of partnerships. Interesting. Okay. So she's in the 7th house of partnerships. Her partnerships are important to her, but they're going to give her the most hell and grief and pain that she's ever experienced in her whole life. And you can see that Saturn retrograde in Virgo is in an exact square to Neptune. Now, you know, that Saturn is also in a trine to Venus and Taurus. And she's been very much like stand by her man. Like she has said, even though he's been convicted, she's not planning on divorcing him. And so that is a very, you know, and actually it's interesting when it comes to her relationships, because who would have thought like such a party girl would end up in a long-term marriage? Now she has been married to Danny Masterson for 12 years. And in the past, she was with him since 2004, married for 12 years. So she's been with him for a long time. So she has carried on a, you know, long-term relationship with her spouse. And she has said that she's going to stand by her man and she's not going to divorce him. Venus trine Saturn. But at the same time, that's going to be one miserable hellhole of a situation. And we can see the Saturn square Neptune. And I'm going to talk about Saturn square Neptune. I'm also going to talk about Scientology and where that shows up in her chart as well, too. So stay tuned for that. Okay. So with her, as the ruler of her ascendant squaring Neptune, just looking at Neptune, Saturn square Neptune in general, just kind of looking at that aspect in general. Saturn square Neptune can show feelings of uncertainty, doubt, disillusionment, lost innocence. Remember the quote I gave you guys? I never had my innocence. Okay. And lamenting, Saturn square Neptune, lamenting due to an undeserved misfortune. Okay, now keep in mind the hard aspect of Saturn square Neptune, lamenting due to one's undeserved misfortune versus taking responsibility for your own existence, right? And those are the two kind of things, right? I'm lamenting due to to my, like, I'm lamenting because I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to have my husband be in prison for 30 years. I'm sad. I'm lonely. I'm disillusioned. I'm a victim, Saturn square Neptune. I'm trapped, like this whole thing. But also Saturn square Neptune demands that we take responsibility for our own existence. Do I want to stay in this position? Do I want to stay married to this fucking asshole? You know what I mean? Like, do I want to find myself in the pits of hell and stay there forever and be trapped forever and be miserable? Or do I want to evolve beyond that? And her chart really is asking that question, I feel. And, Saturn square Neptune can represent the dream of a perfect union that is no more, a sad separation from the fantasy that she created. Okay. And separated because of circumstances out of her control. Disappointment washing over you like a tidal wave, right? Saturn square Neptune. Disappointment, Saturn washing over you like a tidal wave that just hammers you, hopelessness, misery, despair, unclear boundaries, cravings to escape reality. Now that her husband's in prison, and he was very against using drugs because Scientologists don't use drugs. But, now that he's in prison, is she going to want to escape reality and go back to using drugs again? Who knows, but you see that longing for what was. Saturn square Neptune. I'm longing, I'm mourning for what was that can be no more. I also wrote down that Saturn square Neptune represents a loss so great that your willingness to be in reality is tested. Okay. Like, I don't want to be in reality anymore. Saturn square Neptune could also be complete disassociation and denial. Okay. And Saturn square Neptune could be the continuing to victimize yourself or other people, okay? Continuing to victimize yourself or other people to the same horrible consequences over and over and over again. Saturn represents that very slow energy. Neptune, despair, losing hope, like, it's going to go on for 30 years. She's in her partner's house, 7th house of partnership, represented as Saturn square Neptune. This pain is going to go on forever and ever and ever, And so this is like, very epic. And Holly says, makes sense why she'd go for this Scientologist type of guy. Yeah. As an Aquarius rising, it's interesting with the Scientologists because I feel like a lot of Aquarius people are Scientologists. You know what I mean? And I don't know if she fully identifies with Scientology but he definitely does. He definitely does for sure. And I don't think you could be married to someone who is a full Scientologist if you completely rejected it, So that's interesting too. So I'm talking about Saturn square Neptune. And let me tell you guys, Saturn square Neptune is not something to play around with. It is like being trapped in hell and being trapped in misery. And I have Saturn square Neptune in my own chart. So I get it. I know what it is. And I've lived it myself. I've lived in the misery my own self, but it's continuous, slow torture and suffering in a situation that you have no control over. And, and it can be where we're constantly like re-victimizing ourselves or treating ourselves in a poor way, but it could also be where we're victimizing other people and, victimizing ourselves and other people. So that is a very interesting energy, Saturn square Neptune. Now, I also wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about Saturn square Neptune. Now, this picture has nothing really to do with Bijou Phillips. Okay. This has to do with Robin Williams in a movie called What Dreams May Come. But if you want to further understand Saturn square Neptune or understand the Saturn square Neptune vibe, then watch this movie it's probably from 20 years ago. Watch this movie it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's very Dante's Inferno in the modern world, but it's like very emotional. It's a Robin Williams movie. And of course, it's just gut-wrenching agony, Robin Williams, but it's called What Dreams May Come. It's my favorite movie of all time. But what you see here is Robin Williams with his wife in the movie. And Robin Williams dies in a car accident. I'm not going to tell you guys the whole movie, but he does. And then the wife, she ends up unaliving herself because she lost her husband and her children. And in a car accident, she's by herself. And Robin Williams goes through hell to find her. And he finds her in hell by herself, continuing to hurt herself and completely like disassociated from reality. And he looks at her and he knows he only has a certain amount of time to stay with her in hell before he loses touch with reality and becomes immersed in her hell as well. But he's trying to save her. And when he looks over at her, you can see like tears are just streaming down her face, and she's like disassociating, hurting herself, painting something, like, he's trying to talk to her and save her. She's just like, you can just see the despair on her, and she's kind of trapped herself in this world, being unable to forgive her own self for taking her own life. And to me, that is the most Saturn square Neptune type of a thing. And it's deep and it's heavy, 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 heavy. And if you guys want to, if you're interested in astrology and you're like, I want to understand Saturn square Neptune, watch that movie. Watch the scene where Robin Williams goes down to hell to get her. That is Saturn square Neptune. And that is what Bijou Phillips has in her chart in her 7th house of partnership. So this is going to be tough. This is going to be real tough for her. And anyway, so we went through that and we talked about that. It's interesting because Bijou Phillips was born on April 1st, 1980. And there was a Saturn-Neptune square going on at that time. So anyone born around that time is going to have that same Saturn-Neptune square. But it depends on how it presents itself in your chart. It depends on, what it's doing and what the flavor of the overall chart is, right? Because we can't just look at one aspect and go, that's it, it's over. We have to look at the whole chart. But I've already explained the flavor of her chart, and we know what it's like now, right? And we know what she's going through now with this. Okay. And so it's very interesting energy. And Saturn square Neptune trapped in hell. And I'm there because I did it to myself. That's really, really tough. And it's not easy energy. But let's go ahead and see. So she has also said, as a result of this trial and her husband being convicted, that she can't accept what he did and that he's an amazing father, and she believes in his innocence, and she can't, believe what happened. And that's very much, she's in his 7th house square Neptune. It's, that denial. It's that I can't face it. It's too miserable. I don't want to see the truth. I'll just say trapped in this mentality type of a thing. And okay, so let's see what else we have going on here. I want to, with Mercury and Pisces in the 1st house, Pisces, everybody, Pisces, so loving and caring and amazing and all this stuff. Don't forget, Osama bin Laden was a Pisces, okay? And I do think Pisces can be the difficult ones. Some of them can be manipulative liars, and she does have that Mercury and Pisces square Neptune. And I do think she has the capacity to also be a manipulative liar, so we have to keep that in mind as well, based on what I've read about her. And I also want to talk a little bit. Mercury and Pisces can also be, as I said, zoned out, gullible, a pushover, unfocused, especially square Neptune, not doing great. And, but as I said, Mercury in Pisces can also be intuitive and creative. So it's not all bad, but in her case, it's rough. Okay. And I also want to talk a little bit about cults and brainwashing. And because she is a part of Scientology, her husband is in Scientology. Scientology is a cult. We already know that. Sometimes with cults, what I see is a gullibility or a believability. And some of those aspects that come through with people who are wrapped up in that is definitely Mercury square Neptune. It's a very culty, I'll believe anything you say, gullible type of energy. Now, again, I'm telling you guys one of the worst manifestations of Mercury square Neptune. So if you have that in your chart, don't go, oh, I'm susceptible to cults. Oh my God, I'm going to go lock myself in a room. No. But Mercury square Neptune is, susceptible to believing things that aren't true. And we can believe our own lies sometimes too. And also another thing that I think is very susceptible, another aspect that's very susceptible to suffering in cults is Saturn square Neptune, trapped in a world of make-believe or trapped in, because a lot of times cults are very miserable. It's intimidation. I mean, it's intimidation. It's no hope. It's even if you want to leave, you can't. I'm trapped here. It is. And also Saturn square Neptune is spiritual abuse. Like it is something that we can see sometimes in the cases of people who have been subject to spiritual abuse. There is such a thing as spiritual abuse in the world, for sure. People who've been the victim of cult leaders, narcissists, spiritual abusive behaviors, Saturn square Neptune. Another thing that you see with cults is Mercury Pluto, and mind control and brainwashing. And she doesn't have Mercury Pluto in her chart, but an aspect with Mercury Pluto. But, she does have Mercury square Neptune. She does have Saturn square Neptune. And I do think that, the whole Scientology aspect is playing into this too. Okay. And so yeah. And there's other things I could go into, but we'd be here forever. So I'm going to leave it there. Now, so let's see. As I said, Mercury in Pisces can hold large universal concepts in mind and see things from a very, big level, which is not a bad thing. But Mercury in Pisces square Neptune, we can also see a lot of confusion and denial and believing things that don't make sense. And, a reality that's very dark about her family and her family history, right? With that moon Pluto in the 8th house, like burying all that in the 8th house, doesn't want to deal with it, doesn't want to face it or deal with it. Okay, so we went through a lot of different things in her chart. Now I'm actually going to focus on one of the biggest aspects in her chart that I haven't touched on yet. And that is this T-square that she has going on right here. Venus opposite Uranus square Mars, okay? So she has Venus square Mars, she has Mars square Uranus, and she has Venus opposite Uranus, which makes a T-square. And this is a very powerful T-square in her chart. It's very tight. The aspects of this T-square are very, very tight. And as we can see, this Mars Rahu conjunction. So she actually has 4 planets in her, Rahu isn't a planet, but she's got 4 energies in her 7th house of partnership. That Mars Rahu conjunction, because it's within 5 degrees of the 7th house, would technically be in the 7th house. So she has Mars Rahu Jupiter in her 7th house. That's a lot of energy in her 7th house. Now, that Mars Rahu conjunction, Mars, of course, representing sexuality, representing, leadership, courage, bravery, forward moving energy. Mars Rahu, we're going to talk about Mars and the North Node together, particularly in Leo, okay? Particularly in Leo. And also this Mars is retrograde in Leo. So this Mars also has a lot of shit going on with it. It's technically in the 7th house. And in this chart for her, Mars is ruling her second house of money and her ninth house of spirituality, or, Scientology, the religion, what you believe in. Okay. And, planets in the seventh house will tell us what type of partner that we tend to have or attract. So astrology tells us determination by location is immediate. So if you have planets in the seventh house, it does reveal things about your partner. Now, in this case, she has a Mars-Rahu conjunction in the seventh house. Jupiter is also there too. Now, the Jupiter is interesting as well, but the Jupiter is telling me like she has a spiritual partner, or she's having a partner who is very spiritual or very religious, or, thinks that they're very religious. And Danny Masterson is a devout Scientologist, and, he doesn't believe in doing drugs. They don't believe in psychologists. They have their own system that they follow. And so she did get a spiritual / religious partner. Now he's a piece of crap. And that whole system was trying to cover up what he did to those women and trying to harass and stalk those women against filing charges against Danny Masterson. But, nonetheless, it doesn't mean he's a good religious person, but he is a religious person. And so she did get a religious partner. We already talked about the Saturn in the seventh house, but now we need to talk about the Mars-Rahu conjunction in Leo retrograde, okay? Squaring Uranus and squaring Venus. So, interestingly, Holly says they need to belong, feel special, and believe you're smarter than other people. Yeah, yes, Scientologists, right? Smarter than other people, belonging to this thing, know everything more than other people. Interesting energy. Now, first of all, this Venus opposite Pluto square Mars Rahu really, really did it for me, you guys. I was like, oh, what? When I saw this chart. So keep in mind that oh, you guys are going to lose your minds over this. When we have a T-square, we have to break it down step by step before we kind of look at the whole thing. Well, we can look at the whole thing too. One quick point, this Venus-Uranus opposition is actually squaring her south and north node. So we already know, look at how the south and north node divide this chart. Look at how the Venus-Uranus, look at right down the center of the chart, right on her angles. And of course, her relationships are going to be powerful agents of change in her life and affect her fate. Of course they are, right? If you look at this right here and the way this is falling out. Now, I just want to point out a little bit about this Venus in Taurus. So let's start right away with the Venus in Taurus. Now, this Venus at 27 degrees Taurus is actually in a square to her ascendant. Now, interestingly, Bijou Phillips is no friend to women. And when we talk about Venus, we can talk about Venus as being pleasure and lovely and amazing. But there's also like the dark side of the goddess, there's also like the dark side of the goddess that is like an agent of the patriarchy or not believing other women. And look at the ruler of her third house of siblings. It's that Venus, right? The ruler of the third house is Venus, because Taurus is on the cusp of the third house. So her siblings are in a square to her, and that Venus is in a square to her. But, that Venus is in the third house, and the third house is a very social house. So, when she was younger, she did like to go out a lot. She did get a lot of attention for being like extremely beautiful, for looking very beautiful. Venus and Taurus, knowing how to attract, knowing how to like come hither, bring things to her. But at the same time, I don't think she's a friend to women at all. And Venus does represent women and relationships with women. And that is her siblings, her sisters are in a square to her. And she did not believe her sister. As I mentioned, her sister Mackenzie was a victim of a 10-year long abuse by their father, John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. That's her sister, Mackenzie, that was abused by Bijou Phillips' father. Now, Bijou Phillips, when Mackenzie came out, discounted her sister, didn't believe her. When those victims of Danny Masterson came out, made fun of them, didn't believe them, discounted them. She's no friend to women, and it shows. And the fact that she didn't believe her siblings is also very hurtful. But with this Venus in domicile in the third house here in Taurus, she does get a lot of social attention for her beauty. She does get recognized for her beauty, and a lot of people want to date her or talk to her, which is, when she was younger and everything. And, there was probably a part of her that liked that social attention or liked being known for that, or was very flirty or social. The third house is a very social air house. And, people said she was very witty and charming and was kind of like a psychopath who was witty and charming. So, but she's not a friend to women. Okay. Venus in Taurus square her ascendant. She's not a friend to women. And, here's another thing. This is going to blow your guys' mind. Holly says, I was just thinking how interesting her Pallas asteroid placements could reveal a lot about her inner calibrations. You've done a very thorough job here, Nat. Oh, thanks, Holly. Thank you. We're actually going to start talking about a fixed star right now. And I don't always bring fixed stars into chart analysis because the chart is already so filled with information. And the problem with astrology is we have too much information, we don't organize it, and it becomes too mentally overwhelming. So I don't always deal with all the asteroids and the fixed stars because there's just so much here anyway to deal with. And we don't have a whole lot of interpretations that are accurate for those asteroids yet. Like they haven't been tested enough or used enough in charts. But I will tell you guys, there is a very interesting fixed star in her chart that is in a conjunction with her Venus, okay? And all my fellow astrologers who are watching this reading or people who know a lot about fixed stars and astrology, raise your hand if you know the answer. So her Venus in Taurus is actually at 27 degrees Taurus, is actually in a conjunction with fixed star Algol. Algol, that's Algol, Algol. And fixed star Algol has to do with a blinking star and it's said to be located in the star cluster that looks like Medusa or is like Medusa's head. And it's like the blinking eye of Medusa. It shines, that star shines and blinks. And it is called Algol. And Algol has to do with losing your head, or it has to do with death by decapitation. Now, a lot of the definitions of the fixed stars are like very, doom and gloom type of energy. But, in this case, her Venus, her planet of love, her planet of relationships is in a conjunction with Algol. And Algol, like I mentioned, has to do with Medusa's story. Now, if we think about Medusa and the mythology around Medusa, Medusa was assaulted by Poseidon. Sorry, I always say his name wrong. Medusa was assaulted by Poseidon, and Athena found out about it, and Athena turned Medusa into like a monster with snakes coming out of her head. And when people looked at her, they would turn to stone. And Athena did that, even though, Medusa was the one that was attacked and was the one that was assaulted by the god of the sea, So we have this aspect with Algol, fixed star Algol, where it's very much a blame the victim type of a thing. And it's like Athena versus Medusa. Athena, cursing Medusa forever simply because somebody assaulted her. Now, with her Venus of relationships and relating and intimacy and my relationships, like in a conjunction with Algol, she's not a friend Like she's not a, ass kicking Medusa who is going to turn people to stone, who, like come up against her, or, men who, harass or assault other women. No, she's the other side of Algol. She is like the misfortunate and the ruthless and the bigoted side of Algol. And she's the side of Algol that is represented by Athena, that is blaming the victim and punishing the victim. And we can see this with her. Now, Algol is a very malefic star, and it has to do with losing your head, being frenzied, being out of control. And with her Venus, though, there is this whole thing of her not believing people who are survivors of assault, of other women who have been survivors of assault. And so, you can see that her relationships, her lack of being able to face that reality, and her lack of being able to be strong enough to stand up for the women in her life is going to destroy her life. And it is going to ruin her marriage. It's going to ruin her relationships. Back when she got together with Danny Masterson, a lot of Hollywood already knew that he was somebody to watch out for, that he would that he would basically spike your drink, that he was assaulting women, that he was very brutally violent, sexually violent, and just violent in general. But yet, she has a kid with this guy, and yet she marries this guy, and, and doesn't believe anybody, and doesn't believe survivors, and chooses to live in weakness and in denial. And so we can see the way that Algol is really a huge influence in her chart, because this Venus is at the crux of fate in her chart. It is at the bending of the nodes. It is squaring the nodes. And so this Venus is a big energy. Her relationships are a big energy in her chart, and her lack of being unable to believe the women in her life and support them is creating very negative karma for her and for her own child. And it's bad, you guys, it's bad. I think it's very, very bad in my opinion. Okay. Yeah. Synonymous with the org mentality. Yes, Holly. Yes, for sure. And very destructive. Algol has a side of it that's very destructive and creates great losses in relationship. And you can see her lack of being able to stand up and really harmonize with her Venusian energy is really creating complete havoc in her life. Okay. Algo creating, and the weird thing about, Algol having to do with Medusa and women who've been assaulted is that Bijou Phillips herself has also talked about she herself, like having men grope her or inappropriately touch her, or coming on to her in ways that are very uncomfortable for her. Like she's had these things happen to herself, but yet she doesn't support the women in her life when it isn't convenient for her. You know what I mean? It's very hypocritical. It's very bad. And so anyway, we have that going on. And I'm not diagnosing her, but it smells like disassociative. Holly, I agree. It smells like a dissociative disorder. And, there's probably a lot of emotional instability too with the moon Pluto in the 8th house. And of course, that comes from being born to, addict parents who left her alone, who abandoned her, who, the only parent that actually tried to jump in and raise her was her father. So already she thinks her father's this great man. We could say it's a lack of understanding of mentally, being able to understand, but I also feel there's a weakness in her. And I don't mean she can't bench press 100 pounds. I mean a spiritual weakness within her. And, she came out when she was 29 years old and was like, I still don't believe my sister. For years, she said she didn't believe her sister about the abuse. And so many people and the mamas and the papas in that band knew what was going on. They knew there was something going on. Nobody stopped it, but they knew it was known. And so the fact that she just lives in willful ignorance, I don't have a lot of faith in her because of that. And so let's go ahead. So we see that Venus already a major player in her chart. Now, let's also talk a little bit about, the opposition from Uranus. So that Uranus is in her 9th house of spirituality, okay? Higher learning, spirituality, knowledge, beliefs, religion. And, her relationship with Danny Masterson, her relationship, Venus, causes a change in her spirituality, religion, or beliefs, Uranus, right? So here we see she is converting to another religion, or she's having different beliefs because of her partnership and her relationships. And the ruler of that 9th house of spirituality in beliefs is also in her 7th house of relationships. So we can see the connection between her partner and changing beliefs for a relationship for her partner, and the impact that Scientology is having on all of this too. So we can see that 9th house Scientology, I'm switching religions, my beliefs, etc., for my relationship, for my partnerships, or, my partnerships are challenged by the different beliefs of this religion. You could also look at it that way because it's in opposition. So I do think that there is that tie-in with the changing of her beliefs and having to integrate that in her partnerships with Scientology. So we definitely see that aspect too. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk here as well is about this Venus square Mars. And what's interesting with the Venus square Mars retrograde in her 7th house is I think she is probably, and, later on in life, maybe this isn't a big thing for her, but I think when she was younger, getting attention from men or getting, she's a person that needs to have chemistry, like really intense sexual chemistry in her relationships. But I also think at times she is one of those people, maybe a little histrionic too, like really needing attention and sexual attention in her relationships. And so we see that Venus square Mars in the 7th house, and, perhaps fighting in her relationships about, sex or how much sex they're having in the relationship. But I also think we really do need to talk on this Mars Rahu conjunction in Leo in the 7th house. Like, we really need to talk about this one because, like I said, the 7th house planets in the 7th house will tell you about the partners that she picks. Mars Rahu in Leo in the 7th house retrograde could really talk about her picking partners who are sexually insatiable, who are like macho pigs. Now, Mars, of course, is sexuality. Leo, of course, is, prideful. I need to be first. I'm the best. I'm the man. I'm running the show here. Rahu is completely insatiable. Rahu represents fame. Of course, she now has a partner who's famous for sexually assaulting people. He was already famous anyway, but now, Mars Rahu can also indicate illegal activities. And so she does have a partner who's getting in trouble for his, perverted sexual desires and is, and isn't able to control himself, and Rahu wants more and more. So keep in mind what Rahu is, the North Node. I need to consume. It's the head of the snake. I need more. I want more. More. I'm never satisfied, and she may attract partners who are never satisfied sexually, who just need, they need sex like 100 times a week. Otherwise, they're not satisfied. And also with that Venus square Mars Rahu, we could also talk about cheating in relationships as well, because people are not sexually satisfied. And, Mars Rahu in the 7th house square Venus is definitely going to create some fights about their sex life and how much they do and how much they have and what they're doing. But interestingly, Bijou Phillips, we only talk about her being with Danny Masterson, but she was also before him. She was with Sean Lennon, who is the son of John Lennon. And, John Lennon's son, like very kind of emotional, romantic kind of a guy, but Bijou Phillips cheated on him with his best friend. And then that best friend died in an accident right after that. And Sean Lennon, John Lennon's son, was really, really mad at his best friend when he died. And that's like his biggest regret, because his best friend slept with Bijou Phillips and she slept with him too. And then he dies mad at his best friend because of what they did together. So, this type of situation with Venus square Mars opposite Uranus, like taking risks in relationships, cheating, surprising upsets happening, like, monogamy challenging, not being able to keep it in the pants. Like there is energy with there, I feel, especially when you add Rahu to the mix, because Rahu is just out of control, especially with Mars. And Mars can't really tame Rahu. Mars is like, with Mars retrograde in Leo in the 7th house, we could definitely say this is somebody who's very arrogant, egotistical. I wrote down some things here. Mars Rahu in the 7th house, a partner with a huge sexual appetite, a selfish lover, an egotistical, sexually entitled, domineering lover, arrogant lovers who are not ever sexually satisfied, that treat her like she's an object. And that's going to be the title of the thumbnail I put on this video, is going to be, I've always been treated like an object, sexual object, I think. Her attraction to these types of men, Venus square Mars in the 7th house with Rahu. So she has an attraction to these types of men who are like very disruptive, violent, sexually egotistical, arrogant, can't get enough. Venus square Mars, this probably like turns her on in some way, but is also very destructive, very, very destructive. And, Mars Rahu in Leo retrograde could talk about obscene sexual urges. Mars Rahu can also indicate illegal activities, or my partner is engaged in sexual activities that are illegal. Mars Rahu, illegal activities. Okay. Mars Rahu could also indicate like the police force, or, people who are bravely like going in and doing things like from a police force type of perspective. But Mars Rahu could also represent the thief or the criminal as well too. And now we see like, it's Scientology has been covering it up. But, look at Uranus. Uranus is exposing everything, like the shock of it and the like, whoa, of everything is getting exposed. Uranus is, doing its thing too and exposing what is going on here. And Mars Rahu in the 7th house square Venus, and Mars Rahu itself isn't going to be somebody who's like, a total egotistical, entitled, macho pig sex freak, like not for everyone. If you have Mars Rahu, don't worry. But, in this chart, it is square Venus. It is in her 7th house, and it is, squaring Uranus too. So we can see somebody who has unusual sexual desires, a partner who's very like rough and aggressive, sexually aggressive. And a lot of people that talked about Danny Masterson, like the women who basically in court, the ones suing him and the ones, the women that he assaulted, talked in detail about the assaults. And I read about them a little bit, and they were very, very violent, and at one point he pulled out a gun on one of them, and very, very violent and very, like bad, you guys. I don't know if you've read some of the things that Jane Doe number 1 and Jane Doe number 2 said, but they are very, very bad as far as violent, like very, very sexually power hungry and violent. Mars Rahu in the 7th house. Now, on some level, maybe that is what she likes, or it turns her on, or she's just used to people treating her like an object, or just treating her like she's something to use up and throw away. So she's okay with that. Or, you know, it's hard to know everything. Astrology isn't going to explain everything, but there is definitely something going on with that there. And Mars Rahu in the 7th house also explains how she's going to act about her partners too. And how she's going to act is, I don't care what my partner does. I'll defend them to the end. I'll fight you, you know, and like, I will like defend this person and I don't care. I don't care what they do. I'm sticking by them. I don't care how miserable I am. Saturn square Neptune, like we talked about. Okay. So that Mars Rahu energy, very insatiable, very like, you know, no self-control, no ability to hold back, like bad stuff. Okay. And also what's really interesting about Mars Rahu could indicate a partner that has really high blood pressure. Whenever I've seen pictures of Danny Masterson now lately, his face looks really like big and puffy and red. And I'm just red. And it's like, okay, Mars Rahu for sure. Like definitely that energy there. Venus square Mars. I don't care what this person does. Like she's very impulsive in relationships, maybe changed her mind a lot, super impulsive. I don't care what they do. I still want to be with them. I don't care how horrible they are. I still want to be with them. You know, Venus square Mars. And let's see what else we have going on here. Also, what I think is very interesting is the changes in the financial situation that are happening right now, because that Mars is also the ruler of her 2nd house of money, and the 8th house of her partner's money is ruled by that Venus. So their money is in a square to each other. The partner and Bijou, their money is in a square to each other. But you see her money going into his house of money, which, you know, he's going to be in prison for 3 years. He's not going to be able to like work or pay the bills or do anything like that. And so, you know, the financial situation is changing drastically. Her money planet in the 7th house of partners squaring Uranus, her partner, her money situation changes dramatically, Uranus, because of what happens with this court case. So we can see already here too, you know, the problem with the money and how the financial situation is going to change big time. Now, he was fired, Danny Masterson, when all of this stuff started coming out about him, he was fired from the show that he was currently working on Netflix called The Ranch. And so, you know, he had to regroup and figure out how to do something else financially at the time. We also see the ruler of the 8th house, which would be my partner's money, represented by this Venus here, in an opposition to Uranus. So my partner's money situation is changing drastically. And, you know, because of that, I have to put my money in the house of my partner. Now she's going to end up taking care of him, you know, and financially, she's going to end up being the one that takes care of him. And Uranus has that way of like turning something on a dime. And when the turn happens, or when the surprise happens, is typically when a transit is activated. Now, for all of my astrology people out there, where is Uranus right now? Right? Not a trick question. Where is Uranus currently? So Uranus is currently by transit at 23 degrees Taurus. So that transiting Uranus right now is right on Bijou's Venus. And she is right in the middle of her Uranus opposition. Now, the Uranus opposition is a transit that happens to everyone in their 40s. And it's kind of like the midlife crisis transit. but that transiting Uranus is right there on her Venus right now, and it's triggering all of these Uranus issues. And it does, some of it does have to do with money and practical things as well, which that situation is going to completely turn on a dime because of his conviction. And here is what I also think here, that Bijou Phillips is a person that, you know, like is weaker, you know, like we talked about how she has weaker health, maybe a weaker mindset, isn't able to see things for what they are. Like she is now in her partner's 7th house, right? She's located in his 7th house square Neptune. Now, somebody who has K2 rising and has their ascendant ruler square Neptune and is going through a major, you know, midlife crisis change, do they look like they're ready? Does this person look like, does she look like she is, you know, has the energy to kind of support him, support the family without his help? Like, you know, she has money, but, you know, does she really energetically look like somebody who can take over all the duties of the entire family and basically do it all? I don't think her chart reflects that. But the point of the matter is that she's gonna have to do that, you know? And so I think her chart shows somebody who had a really hard early life and now, you know, is drained and exhausted from that. And somebody who's had a lot of health issues and isn't in a position to like run a whole household or maybe like take care of everything, but she's going to have to do that. And we can see she's going to have to call on the power of her sun in Aries in order to do that and accomplish that. And, you know, when we talk about partners, like her partner is also in her 1st house. So she's in her partner's house. He's in her 1st house. Now, I feel like Danny Masterson has a much more like robust constitution than Bijou Phillips. And, you know, his lawyer, Danny Masterson's lawyer, is quoted as saying, oh, you know, he's doing fine. They have him on a mental health watch, but the lawyer is like, you know, while he's in prison, his lawyer is like, oh, he's doing fine. He's mentally strong. He's physically healthy. He's doing completely fine. He's represented by this sun in Aries with this Mars, Rahu, Jupiter conjunction in the 7th house. He's doing fine, you know, like he's healthy. He has more energy than her. He can do more, get more done than she can, is what I feel. But now with him gone, who steps up to actually do it is the question, right? And her chart to me just doesn't look like a person who's like gung-ho on everything, you know, like her chart to me looks like somebody who struggles maybe sometimes to like stay productive, get out of bed, do these types of things. So I think it's interesting with that. And she's weak and her weakness follows her in many ways, unfortunately. And she is caught up in the tidal wave of life, and that tidal wave of life overwhelms her, as we said, Saturn square Neptune. And let's see, anything else that I wanted to point out about the chart? And you know, there's some other stuff I could point out, but I think I want to leave it there. I think Six of Swords Tarot, interesting 6th house. Yeah, very interesting indeed as well. And so, you know, the Mars Rahu conjunction is right there on the cusp of the 6th house. So that energy actually in traditional astrology moves into the 7th house. But when planets are within 5 degrees, they give their energy over to the next house. But yeah, it's an interesting, see, she has a packed 7th house, and that 7th house has Mars, Rahu, Jupiter, Saturn in it. And we already said like her relationships are at the crossroads or the bending of the nodes. So, you know, I do see it, and her Venus is in a conjunction with Algol. So, there is a lot of suffering in her relationships, and there will be a lot of suffering due to the people that she picks in her life and isn't willing to let go of. So that's the price that she has to pay for that. But unfortunately, she also brought a child into the world, and that fifth house of children of her child is this represented by this moon Pluto in the eighth house. So not good energy, really, really tough energy there for her own child, very tough. But I think the very last thing that I will show you guys is the transits that were hitting her chart when Danny Masterson was sentenced. Okay. So we have Bijou Phillips' chart in the center there. And then we have the chart from the day of the sentencing, where he got sentenced to 30 years in prison. And that was on September 7th of 2023 that he got sentenced. And so we're looking at the transits at that very moment. And as I told you guys earlier, look at that Uranus triggering, absolutely triggering. Now, one thing my first astrology teacher told me is that not everything in our chart is active all at once. And, the planets in our chart are like crabs in a barrel, and they want to manifest, and they want to get out, and they want to carry out their karma, their mission, their fate that they have in our lives. But sometimes, those planets are not active until a transit comes along. And this whole thing with the money and, her having to become the provider and his money changing with his money, the eighth house ruler opposite to her natal Uranus, like his money situation is changing. So now the ruler of her second house of money is going into his seventh house of money. So the chart already shows that, but that didn't happen until, this Uranus event happened. And we can see transiting Uranus on the day that he was sentenced is right there on top of her Venus. Isn't that interesting? And like I told you guys, she is having her Uranus opposition right now, which is the midlife crisis. And, Uranus opposition is no joke. Like the way life was before, life is becoming completely different. She was used to being in a safe marriage with a partner who was doing a lot of stuff, reading to the child, taking them for walks, taking them to ballet lessons, whatever he was doing as a father. And now all of a sudden she's finding herself as like a single parent. And, as far as talking about children and the ruler of the fifth house, her children, we have the moon Pluto conjunction in the eighth house. And look at where the south node is right now. That south node, first of all, Chiron too, right? Chiron in the north node opposing the moon Pluto conjunction. And then we also have the south node on that moon Pluto conjunction. So, when Danny Masterson was sentenced to 30 years in prison, I'm sure it felt exactly like the moment when she lost her mother, when she was put into foster care, when she lost her parents, when she felt abandoned by her parents, when she felt alone. I told you guys about the wail that erupted from her when they read the sentence, like she wailed, or the conviction, she wailed. Like the nodes are on that moon Pluto conjunction right now for her, bringing back all those past memories that she shoved down from her childhood. So that is right there. And actually, the wheel of fate and the wheel of karma is affecting her own child as well, too. And, Chiron is transiting Chiron is opposing her moon and that Pluto, very painful wound about, losing her family, being on her own, being abandoned, not having anyone, the dark history. Think of her own father being accused of being a predator. And then now her husband is being accused of being a predator. The nodes of fate are so strong, you guys, that they're just there, and the deep changes that her own family is going to have to go through with her and her own daughter as a result of his sentencing. Now, we don't feel bad for him because he's a predator. And, I think she knew. I think she knew. And he started being investigated in 2017. And it's not until now that he's actually been charged. Because I also looked at the transits for when he started to be investigated. And, back in 2017, when he was starting to be investigated for these assaults, the nodes were right on that Mars-Rahu conjunction that I was talking about. And they were hitting that first house, seventh house axis. And they were right on that Mars-Rahu conjunction. His illegal activities, his, egotistical, abusive, illegal acts, Mars-Rahu, like we talked about, right at the time that the police really started investigating was when her nodes were on that, the transiting nodes were on that Mars-Rahu conjunction. And now it's the release with the moon Pluto. Now is the loss. Now is we're taking him away and putting him in jail, and you're not ever going to see him again for the rest of his life unless he's behind bars. He's not even eligible for parole until 30 years from now. And he's in his mid 40s. So I think he'll be like 77 years old before he's even eligible for parole, So the likelihood of her ever to being able to see him again outside of a prison is very nil. It's very, very nil. And, the deep loss and the deep pain, retriggering all those old wounds again for her. So that is, this chick has had a tough break. Yikes. Yeah, she has. Listen to the beginning of the video, Six of Swords, because I was also talking about, how she is both an abused person, but also an abuser. And, it's hard sometimes because we're like, well, that person had a really tough life, but then a lot of stuff about her, how she's been so unsupportive and, standing by abusers herself and letting them kind of like not standing up for any of the women in her life. Very ugly behavior, but she also has had a very tough life. But also, too, a lot of us have had a tough life, but we're not going to, act that way. So it's a very interesting story with these types of people. So you can see, the transits that are happening in her chart right now are very intense. She is also in the middle of a Neptune square Neptune. Okay, so transiting Neptune is in her first house, squaring her natal Neptune, which is another transit that everyone goes through sometimes in their late 30s. It'll be sometimes in the late 30s or mid 40s, depending on, where your Neptune is at. But it is in that, phase where, we're feeling tired. We're feeling like our body kind of is like fading a little bit. We're getting into older age. Like we're feeling the effects of disillusionment or things not being what we thought they were going to be in our life. Like that Neptune square is pretty tough. And, as far as her feeling exhausted, tired, crying all the time, sad, I think there's also a lot of that going on too, because she's having her Uranus opposition and she's also having her Neptune square right now. And, it's in her first house, so it's hitting her hard. I feel like it's probably hitting her health pretty hard too, as well, like very exhausting, can't get out of bed, tired all the time, probably stuff like that. So we also see this transiting Neptune at 26 Pisces is in an exact quincunx with that Mars-Rahu conjunction. So it's like, I can't believe what's happening. I can't face it. And I don't know what I'm going to do. Again, it's the denial with the Neptune. We can also see that this Neptune in her first house, transiting Neptune, is in an opposition to Saturn. Remember all the things I said earlier about Saturn, Neptune? She has it big time in the form of a transit right now. Look at that. look at the pain and agony of the Saturn-Neptune opposition. You know, all my optimism, everything that I thought this was going to be is completely, you know, put down the toilet, flush down the toilet. And, you know, like I can't even face reality, right? It's really tough energy that she's having to face right now. And, yeah, you know, with the Uranus on her Venus right now, you know, keep in mind, Uranus is in Taurus, and Uranus isn't that great in Taurus because Taurus seeks stability, and Uranus is here to kind of shake things up, especially when it has to do with your resources and your money, which I also think is a big thing that's happening right now. He can't work. He hasn't been able to work since 2017 when he got fired from that Netflix show. They ended up buying some vineyard in Northern California, and he became like a farmer on the land because he couldn't really get hired anywhere after, you know, all that stuff started coming out back in 2017. So, you know, and he's had to pay a lot of damages, and I bet his damages that he's going to have to pay out are going to be in the millions, his legal fees, et cetera. I mean, the money situation is definitely coming up, and Uranus coming up there on her Venus, really rocking the foundation of her relationship and changing things for the rest of her life. You know, so it's a big one. That's a biggie right there. And yeah, Six of Swords. It's just crazy. Like, and it's funny because I didn't have Danny's birth data, so all I could do is look at her chart. But look at all the things that we found out just from looking at her chart. I find astrology is amazing, right? It's just amazing. Holly says she has an opportunity to do a lot of healing work before her Chiron return. I mean, yeah, if she chooses to take it, right? If she chooses to take it, if she, you know, yeah, I don't know. I mean, she has Saturn in her ascendant right now too, which Saturn in your ascendant isn't the worst thing ever. Like, you know, Saturn's very good for building and planning. But I mean, for a person like her, who's more into like believing the stories that she makes up, Saturn in her first house is not going to be a welcome visitor for her. That's a tough one too. Like, I'm forced to reckon with this, you know, and deal with the hardships of life every day, even though I'm damn tired, you know? And so we see that in her charts. And I think that's one thing that's really interesting about astrology is that we could say, oh, Saturn in the first house is horrible, horrible, bad. But not everybody's going to experience it that way. Some people really get their shit together with Saturn in the first house. But when we're judging transits and when we're judging aspects in astrology, we have to pay really close attention to the overall tenor of the chart. You know what I mean? Like, is this a chart that really would enjoy a lot of Saturn energy? No, I don't think so. She's more of like, you know, she's more of like a fairy, you know, Mercury and Pisces, like type of energy. Mercury and Pisces in the first house, square Neptune, the creative mind, that type of thing. Believe what I want to believe. Saturn square Neptune. You know, is she a person that is welcoming more Saturn? Does she deal with Saturn very well? No, I don't think so. Because her own Saturn in her own natal chart is square to Neptune, saying, I don't really like, you know, dealing with this painful reality. So I'm just going to kind of check out. You know, so that's one thing I would caution everybody when you're listening to these readings and you're hearing me go over it. If you have these aspects in your chart and you're like, well, geez, now I'm scared or whatever, or I'm dating someone with that aspect. Oh, no, you know, you have to look at the whole chart and how that is playing into the whole chart. So anyway, yeah, guys, that is what I am getting. And I went for a really long time because I wanted to really dial into this chart for you guys. So I hope that you guys found this reading interesting. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'd love to hear any thoughts, comments, or feedback that you have. Thank you so much, everybody. And namaste, my dear friends. Take care. Bye-bye.